In this video, we're going to talk about the history and the geography of the Old Testament. Both are important for understanding the message of the Old Testament. So first of all, the history. You don't have to memorize a lot of dates and people in this course, but it is important to have sort of a general understanding of the flow of Old Testament history and the dates of some of the more important characters and events in the Old Testament. So let's begin with history. We start at the beginning of the Old Testament in Genesis 1 to 11, and there we have the stories of creation and Adam and Noah. And when we talk about dates for those events, it's very difficult to actually locate those events historically and give them a specific date. Now, I'm not suggesting that those events are not real historical events. It's just difficult to put dates on them. However, when we get to Genesis 12, and especially the character of Abraham, we can talk about the beginning of redemptive history. And we can begin to put certain dates on events and people. So, for example, Abraham, and there's very good evidence that we can say that Abraham lived about the year 2100 BC, and that's when God first really began to work out in time and space his story of redemption with real people in the Old Testament. And then you can see some of the dates of the other characters: Isaac, Abraham's son, and Jacob, Isaac's son. And then there was the 400 years of bondage where the people of Israel were in Egypt. And then, of course, a very important event is the Exodus, when the people left Egypt in about 1450 BC, then the 300 or so period of the Judges. And then we get to David. Of course, David is Israel's greatest king, the best king that they ever had, and we can date David to about 1000 BC. And then as the story goes, after David, the kingdom of Israel splits into two, and there's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And we see this especially told in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings in the Old Testament, where it will talk about these two kingdoms, the north with its kings and then the south with its kings. And it turns out that it's the southern kingdom that seems to be more important for biblical history, because that's the line of David, and that eventually is the line of kings from which Jesus will come. And so we'll talk about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, leading all the way up to the time of Christ. Let's talk a little bit about the geography of the ancient Near East, and especially the land of Israel. You read in the textbook and read in other places that this is the ancient Near East, where people lived in what's called the Fertile Crescent. And that's that green area. It's called the Fertile Crescent because those are the areas where the rivers were. You can see the Tigris and Euphrates here, and here's the Nile River in Egypt. And of course, those are the fertile areas, the places of agriculture, and that's where people would have lived. And so there's the Fertile Crescent again, the Tigris, Euphrates, Nile River in Egypt. Well, here's the land of Israel, right here in this area right here, represented by this pink. And it turns out that God took as much care and planning in choosing the geographic location where his people would live on the earth, just as much as he took in choosing the people themselves, and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And you'll notice that the land of Israel is placed right between these two great kingdoms, Mesopotamia to the north and Egypt to the south. You can see the various people groups that controlled this area of Mesopotamia: the Assyrians, the Babylonians in Old Testament history, and then the Persians and Greeks and Romans in the New Testament history. And then Egypt was always sort of Egypt. But God placed this land right between these two kingdoms. And if you wanted to travel from Mesopotamia to Egypt, you'd have to pass right through the land of Israel. And if you wanted to go from Egypt to Mesopotamia, you'd have to go right through the land of Israel. So God placed his people right in the middle of everything, so that they would intentionally have to interact with Egyptians and Mesopotamians, and that would give them an opportunity to share the story of God's plan of redemption with all of these various nations. And remember, that's God's plan, even in the Old Testament, that the story of grace and redemption wouldn't but just be for Israel, it would be for all the nations. It's just that Israel would be the ones to share that message with the nations. And God placed them right in the middle of the entire civilized world so that they would have an opportunity to do that. Well, here you see a topographical map of the land of Israel, and you can notice that there are various types of topographical constructions in Israel. There's, coastal plain and mountains and freshwater Sea of Galilee, and down here is the Dead Sea. But it turns out that the land of Israel is about 75% desert. And here you can see, this is a pretty typical picture of the land of Israel. Remember, the Old Testament calls Israel the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Really? Because it doesn't look like it from this picture. A land flowing with milk and honey, however, simply means that it's a land full of shepherds and farmers. The milk would be the milk from the goats, and goats and sheep would be watched by shepherds, and they lived mostly in the honey would be from the date palm and would relate to the farming and the agriculture that was available in Israel. So it's a land flowing with milk and honey. The Israelites, when they would get there, would mostly be shepherds and farmers. And if you read the Old Testament and even the New Testament, many of the stories have to do with shepherds and farmers. Of course, the most famous psalm in all the Bible, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, and that's a desert psalm. So the land of Israel really functioned as a land of faith. God placed his people there in that geography in order to build trust in God. And so we can talk about three ways that the land does that. First of all, the land and agriculture. As we just said, the Israelites functioned mostly as farmers. Here's a verse from the book of Deuteronomy. This is just before the people of Israel enter into the promised land, and this is Moses' last piece of advice to the people before they go into the land. He says, the land into which you are entering is not like the land of Egypt, where you came from, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden. But the land into which you are about to cross is a land of hills and valleys and drinks water from the rain of heaven. You might remember that the Nile River in Egypt allowed Egypt to be a very fertile area, a lot of good agriculture because of that river. And the land of Israel would not have a river that would flood and provide agriculture in that way. Rather, the water would come from the rain of heaven. And of course, God is the one who causes the rain. Verse 13, it shall come about, if you listen obediently to my commands, which I am giving you today, then God says, I will give you rain for the land. In other words, when does it rain in Israel? Well, it's when the people obey God and they listen to him. And then God will cause the rain to come and the plants and the crops to grow and the fertility to increase, and the people would be blessed. Now that would be a test, because the local gods in Israel were Baal and Asherah, and the local residents thought of these gods as rain gods. These were the gods who provided the rain. And of course the test would be, would the Israelites trust God? Would they trust Yahweh and listen to his commands, and then God would cause the rain? Or would they worship the gods of the Canaanites? In other words, idols, and therefore be disobedient to God. There's a very famous story in the Old Testament that involves Elijah when the people of Israel were worshiping Baal, the rain god of Canaan. God was unhappy about that, and he sent Elijah, the prophet, to tell the people that there was going to be a drought, that God would cause the rain to stop because the people were worshiping idols. Well, a second way that the land of Israel functioned as a land of faith had to do with politics. Here you can see the map of Israel again, and Israel had no sort of natural borders like a river or a mountain or anything like that, and so the nations from Mesopotamia could easily pass into Israel. Egypt could easily pass up into Israel, and so there were nations going back and forth all the time. Here you can see a map showing that travel right through the land of Israel because there were no natural borders. And it would be very tempting for the Israelites to make political treaties and agreements with these nations in order to be more secure. Again, would the people of Israel trust God in the midst of these nations rather than making treaties and agreements with the other nations? And then finally, a third way that the land functioned as a place of faith and trust had to do with cultural assimilation. Here's the book of Deuteronomy again, just before the people go into the land. Moses says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. When we read the books of Joshua and Judges, and the people go into the land to take over, what they find are Canaanites all over the place. And of course, the temptation would be, would the Israelites adapt to the culture of the Canaanites? Would they worship the Canaanite gods? Would they live in the Canaanite way immorally? Or would they be distinct? Would they live differently so that they could have an influence on those nations? And then when we read the books of Leviticus and Numbers and other places in the Old Testament, a lot of the laws, the food laws, the agricultural laws, were given so that the people of Israel would live differently. They would eat different food, they would wear different clothes, they would have different moral laws, and the reason is, again, for mission, so that they would trust God, learn to live God's kind of life, and have a positive influence on the nations rather than being impacted by the nations negatively. Here's a map again of the land of Israel with the various regions, and you read about these in the textbook: the coastal plain, the Shephelah, the mountains, and the wilderness. Israel's not a big country. It's only about 40 miles from east to west and only about 100 miles from north to south. So it's not a very big place. But of course, as you now know, it's a very significant, influential place as nations and peoples would pass through this land. Here's an actual satellite photo of the land of Israel. Here's the Judean wilderness, the mountains, the Shephelah, and the coastal plain. Well, let's just briefly talk about each of those areas. First of all, the coastal plain. This was, of course, along the coast, right along the Mediterranean Sea, and it looks something like a beach. And the coastal plain is the place where the Philistines lived. The Philistines were the arch enemies of the Israelites when you read a lot of the stories in the Old Testament. Maybe the most famous story in the Old Testament, a battle between the Israelites and the Philistines, was between a famous Philistine named Goliath and the Israelite David. And the Philistines lived right along this coastal plain. The Israelites lived in the mountains here in the hill country, and they would conflict or fight in this area of the Shephelah. So we can think of the Philistines living along this coast and coming up to the Shephelah to fight against the Israelites. Here are some of the famous Philistine cities along the coast. And here's Gath. This is the city that Goliath was from, that we read about in the Old Testament. This is what the coastal plain looks like. That's the Mediterranean Sea, and It looks very much like you would expect a beach or a coast to look like. There you see it again. There's a photograph of a group of Kuiper students who traveled to Israel with me some years ago, and we're along the coastal plain. Well, the Shephelah, as we mentioned, is a land of conflict, because that's where the conflict would occur between the Philistines on the coast and the Israelites in the hill country. And here you can see some of the well-known Shephelah cities: Gezer, Bet-Shemesh, Azekah, Lachish. There are stories in the Old Testament about these very important cities. The Israelites living in the mountains and the Philistines in the coastal plain, and those battles would occur right in the Shephelah. Here's the major highway called the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, that went from Egypt to Mesopotamia and passed right through Israel. Whoever controlled this highway really controlled the world. And mostly that highway was controlled by the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, but one time in its history it was controlled by the Israelites, and that was during the time of Solomon. The most important cities along that Via Maris were Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Those three cities had elaborate gate systems because they were military fortified cities. There's a verse from 1 Kings that talks about Solomon's building projects, and it says that Solomon conscripted labor to build the temple, the palace, the terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And so that was the period in history when the Israelites controlled that highway, the area of the Shephelah, and therefore the whole world. There's an artist drawing of Megiddo. Here you see a model of Megiddo, a fortified city with walls and a gate system. It was meant to protect the Israelites in the hill country. And there's an artist drawing of Lachish, another one of those famous military Shephelah cities. You can see that Lachish actually has a double wall, one at the top and one about 3/4 of the way up, and here's the elaborate gate system. What Lachish would have looked like in biblical times, the double wall and the gate system. This is what Lachish looks like now, and it's been a place of a lot of archaeology, and we'll talk about that later in the course. Well, then let's talk about the desert. The desert is a land of testing. Here you can see a verse from Exodus 15. Just after the Israelites left Egypt, before they went to this promised land, God took them to the desert, specifically the Sinai desert, in order to test them, again, to build their faith, to see if they would trust God. Here's a verse from Exodus 15, right after the people left Egypt. It says, the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there he tested them. And he said, if you listen to me and do what is right, I'll bless you. But if you disobey me, I'll judge you. Specifically, the Israelites spent 40 years in this Sinai desert. We can sort of think of the land of Egypt as Pharaoh's land, very fertile land, the promised land as your land, and then the desert is God's land, because it's a place where you can listen to God's voice and learn to obey his commands. Again, here's a verse from Deuteronomy just before the people leave the desert and go into the promised land. Moses says, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert for 40 years. Why? Well, to humble you and to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. And here's Deuteronomy chapter 8. I won't read the whole thing, but he led you into the vast and dreadful desert, that thirsty and waterless land with snakes and scorpions. He brought water from the rock. He gave you manna from the desert to humble you and test you that it might go well. Of course, the desert is a severe place. It's a place where you need to learn to trust God for water, for food, for direction, to know where you're going. And this is where God took the Israelites for 40 years in order to build trust, to get them to listen to his commands and follow him. This is a satellite photo of that desert region, and you can see how severe it is. There's the Judean desert in Israel, also a severe place. That's what it looks like today. There are Bedouin who still live in the desert with their sheep, and there you can see them. And there's an actual picture of the Sinai desert, the place where the Israelites spent those 40 years learning to trust God for water, for food, and listen to his voice. There's Mount Sinai, the place where Moses received the Ten Commandments in that Sinai desert. It's a desolate place. And they had to trust God for manna and for water. And of course, those stories in the book of Exodus show how God provided that when the people listened to him. Here are two psalms written by David. These are desert psalms where David is reflecting on the lessons learned in the desert. Psalm 42, as the deer pants for streams of water, my soul pants for you. When we long for water, we wonder where the water's coming from, and God provides it. It's like longing for God. Here's Psalm 63. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My body longs for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. When you're in the desert, you learn to trust God for everything. And in fact, eventually the Israelites developed a positive memory of the desert. Here you can see some of the Old Testament verses about that. Here's Deuteronomy 1:31. Moses said, in the desert, the Lord carried the people like a father carries his son. Hosea talks about God speaking tenderly to the people in the desert, forming a covenant, forming a marriage with them in that initial period in the desert. And then here's Nehemiah, looking back on that desert experience where he says, for 40 years, God sustained them in the desert. They lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, nor did their feet become swollen. That's amazing that the people would learn to see a severe place as the desert in a positive way, a place where God provided them for them, and they learned to trust God. When we get to the New Testament, you remember that one of the first events in Jesus' life is that he's taken into the desert and tempted by the devil. Jesus was led to the desert to be tempted by the devil. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. And on each of those three temptations, Jesus quotes from the book of Deuteronomy. We need to learn to trust God for food. We can't put God to the test. And finally, we need to worship only God and trust him. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. As God provided manna in the desert, now in the New Testament, Jesus says, I'm your sustenance. I'm your food. And here Jesus says, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me. And Jesus compares himself to being like water, satisfying and filling. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. In the desert, the people followed that pillar of fire to know where they were going. And here Jesus says, I'm that light, and you need to follow me to know where you're going. And then we get to the hill country, the mountains in the land of Israel. And as we already mentioned, the Israelites lived in these mountains, lived in the hill country. Here's the map again of those mountains. You can see them. And this is where the Israelites lived. A lot of stories about these cities. And then you remember the division between north and south. The southern kingdom called Judah and the northern kingdom called Israel. This is a photograph of the hill country today. You can see some of the mountains there of Jerusalem. where the Israelites lived. There's a photograph of Jerusalem today. This is what Jerusalem looked like in David's day in 1000 BC. Just a small little finger-like city, and then the Temple Mount at the top. This is Jerusalem in Hezekiah's day, about 700, and you can see it's expanded onto the western hill. And then there's a picture of Jerusalem in Jesus' day, in the hill country, in those mountains. There's that David finger-like city, the western hills of Hezekiah, and then spreading out even further in Jesus' day with this elaborate Temple Mount built by Herod the Great. We'll talk about that in New Testament. There's a picture of Jerusalem today with that Temple Mount and the finger-like city of David. And then just a word about Galilee, which is located in the northern part of Israel, around the Sea of Galilee. And we refer to Galilee as the land of Jesus because Jesus spent 98% of his life on earth in and around Galilee and the Sea of Galilee. Here's the Sea of Galilee and the various regions around Galilee. Jesus spent most of his life there. In fact, he spent most of his life in ministry in these three cities: Chorazin, Capernaum, and Bethsaida. There's a photograph of that northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee where Jesus spent most of his life. There were a lot of synagogues around the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus did most of his teaching in those synagogues. Here's Matthew 9. Jesus went through the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the good news of the kingdom. One of the more well-known synagogues was in Capernaum, which became the headquarters for Jesus' earthly ministry. But of course, that's a New Testament story. So that's a little bit about the history and geography of the land of Israel that figures into the message of the Old Testament.